let's talk about the Glock 43. 9mm subcompact pistol from Glock. Obviously, Glock has a great reputation in the firearms industry for high reliability and high value. No, it's not the cheapest pistol you can get, but in the world of handguns, it's also not really expensive either. Often, new shooters and female shooters would be tempted to go for the smaller size handguns because they would fit more comfortably in their hand. And they kind of feel, oh, well, I'll just start with the smaller gun because that's less scary as opposed to a larger gun. But when it comes to handguns, very often the smaller handguns, such as the Glock 43, are a lot harder to use when compared to a Glock 34 or a Glock 17 or a Glock 19. So all the handguns I just listed are all 9mm pistols, so they all shoot the same cartridge. That's relevant because if a larger, say a full-size Glock 17 or a Glock 34 is all of a sudden shrunk down into the very subcompact Glock 43, and they both fire the same bullet, that same energy concentrated down into a much smaller area results in the felt recoil. So how hard the gun kicks, the felt recoil is going to be a lot higher. It's going to be a lot harder to aim accurately because your sight radius is much shorter, your barrel's a lot shorter, and just everything is scaled down. So that puts a lot more stress on the components, and it would also put a lot more stress on your wrists and your hands when you contain that recoil. Another thing about your subcompact guns, such as the Glock 43, is they are going to have a lot lower capacity. So a full-size Glock 17 is going to hold 17 rounds in the magazine plus one in the chamber. A Glock 43, 6 rounds in the magazine plus one in the chamber. So harder to aim, harder to shoot, kicks harder, less chances to hit the bad guy. When we are talking about guns like the Glock 43, we are talking about a self-defense type handgun, so within that reference. The one thing that the Glock 43 truly excels at is just ultimate concealability. If you need a gun that is really going to minimize printing, be extremely lightweight, be very reliable, even in adverse conditions you'd probably never find yourself in, then the Glock 43 is worth considering. I've owned my Glock 43 for probably about 4 years, and I've put somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 rounds through it. Now, that is a lot more than most people would probably put through their Glock 43 in their entire lifetime. I shoot a lot. That said, it is still a machine, and you do need to periodically clean it and maintain it. I have found that about every 500 rounds is about the sweet spot to clean it. You go much past 500 rounds, depending on what kind of ammunition you're shooting. If you're shooting dirtier reloads that might not burn as clean, or be less reliable, or out of spec, after about 500-600 rounds, it will start to jam, and you'll get some issues like that. That said, I mean, 500 rounds out of a concealed carry self-defense pistol is kind of a lot. So as long as you clean it after every range trip, it's just going to work as long as your ammo's within tolerance. For the purposes of this video, I did want to push the handgun further than your average situation. We threw it in the mud and did simulations of situations where you might find yourself on your back trying to retrieve your handgun out of, say, like a mud puddle, something like that. In this area, there's quite a bit of glacial sand and runoff, so that was very, very gritty, muddy water that the handgun was submerged in. It did fire. I did have to manually cycle it. I did the test multiple times, about the 3rd time in a row of submerging it in the mud. I did have to cycle it just about every round, but I was still able to fire the handgun at the threat and hit the target. When we did the mud test, you'll notice that I was shooting with my weak hand, so my left hand because I'm right-handed. After doing the USPSA match with the Glock 43, my right wrist was really flaring up as far as pain and discomfort. That's a pre-existing condition that I had already from some other injuries. I'm currently undergoing regenerative injection therapy to help rebuild the cartilage in my right wrist. So the Glock 43 is definitely going to have pretty snappy recoil if you're getting high round counts and stuff like that with it. So the 43 is really a compromise in terms of accuracy, capacity, ease of shooting, comfort, ergonomics. Everything is an absolute compromise. And it's a compromise so that it can do one thing extremely well, and that is be ultimately concealable. So however fast you could shoot with a full-size handgun or even a mid-size handgun, say like a Glock 19, as well as you can shoot with your full-sized handgun, you're going to lose a certain amount of ability and performance when you go down to the Glock 43. So for that reason, I don't think I would recommend a Glock 43 as your only handgun. As a deep concealment handgun and something that is going to be ultimately concealable, I absolutely would recommend the Glock 43. I have found it to be very reliable within its performance envelope. If it goes to the bottom of a mud puddle filled with glacial silt and you try to fire with your non-dominant hand and trying to hit targets and stuff like that with it when you're laying down in the mud, you might have to cycle the action a few times. You might get a few failure to fires, a few failure to feeds, but you can still shoot. That said, in any of your more practical everyday situations, the Glock 43 is very reliable. Is it the ultimate handgun? No, it's an absolute compromise. Its primary claim to fame is that it is ultimately concealable, and everything else is secondary to that. The Glock 43 is a very, very small concealed carry 9mm pistol compared to a full-size 9mm such as this Glock 34, which is more of a duty pistol and more specifically a competition pistol. You'll notice just how small the 43 is. I'm putting it up next to a cell phone that's a Galaxy S7 for reference. And why this is relevant is that it makes the Glock 43 ultimately concealable, but also comes with the side effect that the same energy of a 9mm cartridge that would go through this full-size 34 has to go through this much smaller package here in the 43, and that means that your recoil spring is going to be much stiffer, that your internal components, because they are smaller, are going to experience a lot more stress for a given area. Another place that you'll notice the energy of the 9mm cartridge going through a much smaller package in the Glock 43 is you'll notice it in felt recoil. And when you have only 2 fingers, sometimes actually not even 2 whole fingers on the grip, and then your trigger finger to pull the trigger, that is really not a lot to hang on to a gun. And so that means that all the recoil of that 9mm is going to be going through this 1.5 fingers here, and the gun itself is also lighter, the slide is smaller, the reciprocating mass is lighter, so that means that your felt recoil and your snap is going to be a lot more strain on your hand, and it's also going to make follow-up shots a lot harder. In addition, you'll notice the very short sight radius of the Glock 43 compared to the longer sight radius of the Glock 34. This is going to make it a lot harder to be accurate, but with enough practice, you can make hits out to 20-25 yards with the Glock 43 despite its small size, short sight radius, increased recoil, etc. Many times a new shooter or a female shooter that might have smaller hands or somebody that's inexperienced with firearms, they might be tempted to go for one of these smaller pistols because they're more comfortable to grasp. However, that can be a mistake because, as I mentioned earlier, all of the same energy that goes through this larger firearm going through this much smaller firearm means that the felt recoil is going to be much more intense on this smaller firearm. It's going to be harder to aim. Everything about this gun is more difficult and less forgiving, and you also get much less ammo. One of the magazines will have a flat base plate, so it's 6 rounds in this magazine, and then you could put 1 in the chamber, so 6 plus 1. It also comes with this extended base plate magazine, which makes the overall length of the grip longer to where you can get the other half of your ring finger on and your pinky finger somewhat on, halfway on the grip, and get a lot better grip on the handgun for better recoil control and a lot more comfortable shooting. That's all well and good. However, this added length of the grip does not actually give you any greater capacity. So you end up with a longer magazine, noticeably longer magazine, that still only holds 6 rounds plus 1 in the chamber. Overall, if I'm going to have a longer magazine, why not have another round or two? For my money, if I'm going to have a longer magazine, I would much prefer to have a few more rounds on board. So your Glock 43 is going to be more like this. It is not the hammer that you really want, but it might be the hammer that you have, and it might be the hammer that you could take with you. You'll notice in some of the footage that I did have some trouble seating magazines at the USPSA match. I'm going to chalk that up to user error. I am getting my middle finger and half of my ring finger on the gun. So this means that it is actually very difficult to insert new magazines into the firearm. I seemed to have that trouble a little bit more with the aftermarket ETS magazines. I don't know if that's because I had them just all the way topped off and they were just had to be seated a little bit harder. I don't know why exactly that was. I seem to notice it with the ETS magazines. That said, if you seated the ETS magazines, the aftermarket magazines harder, bam, really got it in there, then I did have them work just fine. A lot of people will be critical of the stock factory Glock sights because the factory Glock sights are plastic. Are they the best sights in the world? Absolutely not. That said, I don't think in any kind of reasonable situation you're going to be breaking sights off. At one point at the USPSA match, when I passed about 600 rounds through the gun and using out-of-spec reloads, that some of the cases were a little bit too fat, and I ended up with a stuck case in the handgun, and I actually had to clear that jam by hooking the rear sight onto a wooden post and just putting my whole weight on that thing to really just push it and just force it to eject that jammed case. So I managed to do that. It did push the sight off center a little bit, so partway through the match, I did go ahead and end up and have to like hit that with a rock to kind of get the sight back in the center so I could finish the match. So plastic sights, I don't think they're really a problem. They're not great sights. I don't know if it's really worth putting cool sights on it. Maybe, I mean, but don't. You'll hear some people in the tactical and the training community say that, oh, well, those Glock sights are going to get busted off. And it's like, well, if I'm putting a lot of my weight on there and racking jammed cases out with the factory plastic sights and they're not breaking off, they're probably not going to break off. So that's one thing that people are critical of on Glocks. And I don't know, it seems to be okay. So let's see, would I recommend the Glock 43? Yes, I would. As a subcompact 9mm that is ultimately concealable, yes, I would recommend the Glock 43. Is it going to be the equivalent of a full size, say like a Glock 17 or Glock 34? Absolutely not. Should the Glock 43 be the only pistol that I would recommend somebody own? No, absolutely not. You're going to need a lot of practice with a pistol to get to where you could be able to hit targets with a Glock 43 up to 25, 30 yards, stuff like that. That is not going to come easy. And it would be hard to get enough practice using the Glock 43 because it gets to be an uncomfortable gun to shoot after several magazines due to the recoil, etc. And the heavier recoil, the increased muzzle blast from the shorter barrel, just everything is going to make it harder to learn how to shoot well on the Glock 43. So I'd actually recommend getting a larger handgun to practice and just really just drill down on your fundamentals. So I wouldn't recommend having the 43 be your only pistol. And I definitely recommend getting a larger pistol, say a full-size service caliber pistol, full-size 9mm, to practice and just get a lot of familiarity with shooting targets, target transition, the shooting on the move, just all of those things that you would want to do with a handgun, drawing from concealment, everything. So yeah, Glock 43, reliable for what it is. It is a micro subcompact. It is not a replacement for a full-size service pistol. Definitely not going to be a replacement for that. I pushed my Glock 43 a lot farther than most anyone's ever going to do, and I found it to be reliable. I can go running with it. I can wear it when I go to formal events, tailored suits, tailored shirts, things like that. Wear it just fine, no problem. I've never had anybody catch me printing, and so there you go. So Glock 43, ultimately concealable, and within its performance envelope, as long as you clean it every 500-ish rounds, it's going to be very reliable. So that's what I got. Hope you enjoyed the video, and thanks for watching.